Welcome to FanFic Nation, where worlds rise and fall, heroes challenge destiny, and what if becomes legend. From epic wars to untold paths, this is the nation of fan-made stories. Subscribe and step beyond the canon. This novel is written by JD 787. Strictly speaking, this was yet another accident caused by a lack of foresight. I wanted to dismantle Littlefinger's scheme, and I succeeded. So far, Petyr himself had lost his influence in King's Landing, and the final piece he had placed in the Vale was now under siege. A generation's worth of conspiracies had been unearthed and exposed to the light by a single wave of a time traveler's hand. But when I came up with this idea, I had only considered Petyr. I had forgotten about the woman caught in the affair, and now, as a result, the interests of this supposedly clever time traveler were being threatened by a wildfire of rumors. Aegor let out a bitter smile. There was no such thing as a perfect solution. Taking down a major villain so easily was bound to have consequences. Now that things had come to this, there was no point in regret. What he needed to do was assess the trajectory of events and find a way to benefit from the situation, or at the very least, minimize the damage. Given that he was an outsider with limited knowledge of this world, Aegor knew his deductions about the situation were bound to have blind spots. Things would be much easier if he had someone well versed in Westerosi politics to offer insights and join in the discussion. So that night Tyrion learned the news. After some deliberation, the two arrived at a grim conclusion: war was inevitable. From the perspective of a time traveler who knew the truth, the so-called Alliance of Justice had acted in a way that could, without exaggeration, be considered just. They had removed the young heir of House Arryn from his unstable and dangerous mother, a woman who had poisoned her own husband. They had placed him under the care of several major noble houses with no interest in rebellion, ensuring he would be raised and educated properly to grow into a capable and moral ruler, trained in both governance and warfare. It was a noble ideal. But the problem was that while Aegor had released the truth, it had spread in the form of rumors, and rumors by their very nature could not be used to justify the disruption of the established order. As king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the first man lord of the Seven Kingdoms and protector of the realm, Robert Baratheon could never tolerate one of his major vassals being forcibly stripped of power by a group of lower-ranked lords. If such an act of defiance were allowed to stand, it would set a dangerous precedent. The authority of the crown would be trampled underfoot. A king who could not protect his bannermen was no king at all. Even if the accusations against Lysa Arryn were proven true, it was the king's right alone to deal with her, not some coalition of minor lords. It was harsh, but that was the nature of feudal rule. The Iron Throne and the so-called Alliance of Justices will likely enter a period of prolonged negotiations, Tyrion analyzed, but it's unlikely to lead to any meaningful resolution. After securing the throne, Robert made several compromises to stabilize his reign. He chose not to punish House Martell and House Tyrell for their support of the Targaryens. He married my sister to secure an alliance with the Lannisters. He named Jon Arryn as Hand of the King to placate the Starks, Tullys, and Arryns, houses that had fought for him but had not been properly rewarded. All of these were deals struck with great houses. Swallowing his pride to work with them was humiliating but not disgraceful. But who are the Royces and Waynwoods in comparison? Tyrion took a sip of wine and frowned. Besides, our dear king has been restless for years. Tournaments are no longer enough to satisfy him. Even if it's just to relive the thrill of leading an army, Robert will refuse to back down. And that alliance, having taken their first step, will never simply bow their heads and go home to await punishment. Aegor understood Robert well enough not to dismiss him outright. The man was no statesman, but he had been an exceptional battlefield commander. Fighting him head-on was one of the worst mistakes anyone could make in Westeros. The fate of Balon Greyjoy's rebellion was proof enough of that. So where does their confidence come from? Aegor asked. How do a few noble houses in the Vale expect to stand against Robert? Their confidence comes from the Bloodygate and the kingdom's financial troubles. Tyrion leaned back in his chair. To put it simply, an impregnable mountain pass and an empty royal treasury. For thousands of years, the Bloody Gate has never been taken by force. The Alliance of Justice captured it through treachery, and they'll never give Robert the chance to do the same. And as for the treasury, um, anyone with half a brain in King's Landing knows it's a mess. If Robert marches on the Vale and gets bogged down at the Bloody Gate for a month or two, he'll have no choice but to negotiate. Aegor felt a chill run down his spine. If the treasury is empty, Robert will turn to his vassals for loans. His voice grew heavier. That means our creditors might cash in their bonds, and the investments we just secured could collapse before they even begin. Exactly. This is a serious problem for us. Tyrion exhaled slowly. If Robert goes to war, my father will send troops to support him. And while the Lannisters have deep pockets, we don't just throw gold away. Right now, even I wouldn't be able to borrow money from my own family. Aegor let out a deep breath. We need to do the math. How much strain can our finances handle? After running the numbers, they reached a sobering conclusion. To maintain their financial stability, they would have to immediately dismiss all employees, halt factory construction, withhold wages, delay payments on ongoing projects, and consolidate every last coin at their disposal. This included personal assets and even the funding the Iron Throne had allocated for the Night's Watch. Even under these drastic measures, their capital reserves could only cover about 70% of the potential bond redemptions. A decent margin, but only just. And this was only the beginning. The game had barely started. They hadn't even begun to truly spend. If the redemption volume stayed below half, their business could continue at a reduced scale, but the capital chain would remain precarious, always on the verge of breaking. If it exceeded half but stayed under 70%, their only option was to hold on and pray that Robert won quickly and returned to King's Landing. But if it surpassed 70%, then Aegor might as well pack his bags and head east to join the Dragon Queen, while Tyrion would have to start considering how to beg his father, Tywin, to clean up the mess. After all, Tyrion was still Tywin's son. Even if he was an outcast, he wouldn't suffer too much. But Aegor, he was a deserter from the Night's Watch, a failed schemer in King's Landing who had run when things went south. Why would Daenerys Targaryen ever take him in? Unacceptable. Aegor's face twisted in frustration. Losing financial backing was bad enough, but the worst part was that the force cutting him off wasn't even a person. It was an uncontrollable situation, leaving him nowhere to direct his anger. Calm down. The more flustered you are, the harder it'll be to think of a solution, Tyrion said smoothly. We were the first to learn of this. That gives us an advantage. Can you think of anything we can do with this head start? The phrase head start sparked something in Aegor's mind, and an idea struck him like lightning. What would he have done if he had come across this kind of insider information before he had ended up in this world? Dump any stocks that might crash because of the bad news and shift investment toward military industries. Even if war broke out, it would be a localized conflict. Even if Robert suffered a setback at the Bloody Gate, the Vale's lords didn't have the guts or the strength to march on King's Landing in retaliation. On the contrary, once they had burned off some energy in this skirmish, internal tensions in Westeros might ease for a time, meaning the overall situation would stabilize. If that happened, his financial position wouldn't completely collapse. He just had to hold on. We need to immediately stockpile food and military supplies, Aegor said decisively. Once word gets out, prices for both will skyrocket. We can profit from the price difference and keep our capital chain intact. What? Tyrion looked at him in shock. Who suddenly buys up that much food and arms out of nowhere? You'd be announcing to the world that you have insider knowledge and are trying to profit from the war. Do you take the people in power for fools? This is bad. People in power. I'm not just anyone. You keep forgetting that. Aegor narrowed his eyes, his confidence growing. The more he thought about it, the more feasible the plan seemed. I'm the chief logistics officer of the Night's Watch. 100,000 wildlings are pressing up against the wall. As part of our war preparations, I buy a massive amount of food and weapons and send them to the watch. Who could say anything about it? At worst, Eddard Stark will pressure me to keep prices fair, but he's not going to have me executed over it. As long as I make the purchases look legitimate and play my role convincingly, this could work. Tyrion stared at Aegor in silence, processing the plan. He was, after all, technically the Night's Watch's logistics officer. But war profiteering was a dangerous game, and trying to snatch food from the lion's jaws was an even greater risk. Was it worth the gamble? Then, suddenly, Tyrion's sharp mind clicked into place. A slow grin spread across his face. You know, you're not wrong, the dwarf admitted. Stockpiling supplies as the Night's Watch quartermaster is a reasonable cover, but the way you're planning to do it is still too risky. I have a better idea. Make it look like you're giving up most of the profit. Bring others in, let everyone make some gold together. That way, we guarantee our safety. The next morning, Aegor and Tyrion rose early, taking with them the certificate signed by Eddard Stark and the letter of commission from Mormont. Without wasting any time, they launched into their first true shopping spree since arriving in this world. For the first time since its establishment, the Night's Watch office remained closed in the morning. Every employee, including Jaqen, followed their chief supervisor through the bustling trade hubs of King's Landing, Iron Street's warehouses, and the Blackwater River port on a massive procurement mission. The role of the guards was straightforward: carry the money and ensure its safety. A peculiar and intimidating entourage roamed the marketplaces. Several Night's Watch brothers clad in black, armed and watchful, two fully armored Lannister guards in dark red plate, and a dwarf recognizable to nearly everyone in the city. Such a conspicuous combination made it highly unlikely that anyone in King's Landing would dare to entertain any ill intentions toward them. They brought with them half their total funds, over 1,000 gold dragons. By the time the sun had fully risen, they had already secured deals with several of the city's most well-stocked merchants. Their purchases a staggering amount of supplies, enough provisions to feed the entire Night's Watch for several months, hundreds of horses, and a vast arsenal of steel swords, crossbows, and enough arrows to arm 70 or 80 men to the teeth in an instant. They didn't bother haggling, instead paying slightly above the market rate, putting down a deposit equal to one-tenth of the total cost. Their only demand was that the merchants sign a contract. The agreement stipulated that all goods were to be tallied and gathered in the port warehouses as soon as possible, then shipped to Eastwatch by the sea within 2 weeks. Upon delivery to the Night's Watch at the Wall, the transporter would receive a receipt from Eastwatch's garrison, which they could then present at the Night's Watch office in King's Landing to claim the remaining 90% of the payment. As for penalties, if either party breached the contract, the offending side would forfeit an amount equal to the deposit, one-tenth of the total payment. Put simply, if Aegor suddenly decided to back out of the deal, he would lose his entire deposit, essentially handing free money to the merchants. Conversely, if the merchants failed to uphold their end of the bargain before the goods were shipped, they would be required to return double the deposit as compensation. On the surface, the terms seemed fair and the price reasonable. However, in reality, Aegor did not have the funds to cover the remaining 90% of the payment. What he had done was leverage the situation to gain temporary control over a vast cache of food and weaponry, goods worth 10 times the deposit and 5 times the total assets of the Night's Watch. Once word spread about the upheaval in the Vale and the Red Keep caught wind of it, the prices of food and arms would inevitably skyrocket. What Tyrion had deduced, those seasoned merchants who thrived on trade and war speculation would also figure out, perhaps just a step behind. Before Robert could even muster the Seven Kingdoms armies to march north, the cost of grain and fodder would surge by well over 10%. But Aegor and Tyrion weren't looking to profit from the price hike itself. Instead, they aimed to collect the penalties from breached contracts. The reasoning was simple: profiting off price surges was akin to plundering a lion's den, extremely dangerous. Any merchant capable of supplying such vast amounts of goods had significant backing, noble title or not. If Aegor attempted to resell those supplies at a higher price without the ability to pay the remaining balance, the entire scheme would collapse. The original suppliers wouldn't just sit back and let someone else profit off their goods, not without consequences. The deal would reach a deadlock. If the deposit had come from Aegor and Tyrion's own pockets and they were reckless enough to take the risk, they could have negotiated for an even higher penalty clause, squeezing even more out of the merchants. But in reality, with creditors already knocking to redeem debts, the capital chain would soon tighten, then snap altogether. And once that happened, it would all be over. By taking the initiative to concede, accepting the penalties, and playing the role of the wrong party, they would appear as mere victims of the merchants' broken promises. On the surface, it seemed like they were sacrificing the larger profit, but in truth, they were walking away with a substantial sum without attracting unwanted scrutiny. Best of all, it would keep them out of trouble. After all, the goods never actually passed through their hands, and the Night's Watch could simply claim to be another casualty of rising food and weapon prices. Who could accuse them of war profiteering? And then there was the matter of the current hand of the King Eddard Stark, a man known for his honor and rigid sense of duty. Committed to governing the Seven Kingdoms justly, he would never allow the campaign against the Welsh rebellion to turn into an unchecked profiteering spree for arms dealers and grain merchants. Before those merchants could even count their ill-gotten gains, sanctions could rain down from above. At that point, it would become a power struggle between the forces backing those merchants and the king's future father-in-law, the hand of the king himself. So long as Robert Baratheon still sat on the throne, Eddard held the upper hand. The question was not whether he could suppress these profiteers, but rather how much he was willing to compromise with the local power players of King's Landing. How much of a price hike would he tolerate before stepping in? That would depend on the outcome of his ongoing battles, both in open court and behind closed doors against the city's nobility and wealthy elite. Regardless of how that struggle played out, Night's Watch Industries had already secured its profits. With the penalty fees in hand, they could settle their outstanding debts. Through strategic foresight and timely action, they had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of fundraising and business survival, clearing their first major hurdle. From here on out, the road to expansion and prosperity lay wide open before them. The above was what Aegor and Tyrion had envisioned. According to their plan, these steps would likely take a few days to a week to fully execute. If by chance a particularly diligent merchant had already tallied their inventory and was prepared to ship the goods north, the chief logistics officer might have needed to find some excuse to delay the process. After all, once the ship set sail, they would have to worry about the remaining 90% of the payment. But in reality, everything unfolded at an astonishing speed. Aegor wasn't the only one with eyes and ears in the royal court. The news of the uprising in the Vale had first reached King's Landing through a raven sent by the very faction that initiated the rebellion. Varys' intelligence network, as extensive as it was across the Seven Kingdoms, could not outpace the speed of that raven. The incident had erupted too suddenly, and while his little birds were everywhere, they simply couldn't be faster than a message in flight. As a result, the first person in King's Landing to learn of the upheaval was Grand Maester Pycelle, who oversaw the city's ravens. He received the information from the official declaration of the so-called League of the Just. The second person was Queen Cersei. However, with her utter lack of political foresight, she neither considered its implications nor thought about how it might affect her own position. Next came Varys, though the eunuch's true allies and long-term plans lay far beyond Westeros across the narrow sea. Seeking the Iron Throne for his chosen ruler, he had neither the means nor the interest to profit from a war economy in King's Landing. The fourth to receive the news was the hand of the king. Only after he convened a royal council and briefed Robert did the rest of the ministers, and finally the king himself become aware of the situation. And then there were the spies scattered throughout the Red Keep, listening intently for valuable information. These spies would try to smuggle the news to their respective patrons. Once those patrons grasped the full implications of the civil unrest, they would dispatch their own people to warn merchants aligned with their interests hold on to stock because prices were about to surge. But all of this took time. The informants inside the palace, the ears and eyes of noble houses and trading consortiums, were mostly lowly servants and handmaidens whose movements were strictly controlled. They could only leave through the gates at designated times in the morning and evening. Even after sleeping out, they had to find ways to deliver their reports. And their masters, they weren't sitting in fixed locations all day waiting for messengers to arrive. In an era without telephones or instant communication, relaying intelligence required patience. And then there was Arya. During lunch, she had overheard her father, Eddard Stark, discussing the situation in the Vale with his advisors. She even learned the specific time of the emergency royal meeting scheduled for that afternoon. Not long after, as was her habit, she left the Red Keep with her guards and rode to the Night's Watch office. As usual, she chatted with Aegor for a while before heading to her sword fighting lesson. Before she left, she casually relayed what she had heard, treating it like just another tale, another bit of exciting gossip. To Arya, it was simple. Igor was always telling her adventure stories. In return, she naturally wanted to share something equally thrilling. What could be more interesting than the fact that her aunt, an aunt she had never met, was now besieged in the Eyrie? And so, in this frantic race to control information, Aegor unwittingly became the little finger. The one person most likely to have seized the advantage had been placed under house arrest at the treasury due to his involvement in spreading certain rumors. And just like that, through a mix of luck, timing, and sheer happenstance, Aegor ended up ahead of everyone else. By the time the purchases were completed, the sun was high overhead. When Aegor and Tyrion returned to the office, it was already past noon. By then the market had shifted. Anything that could be of use in war was no longer being sold at a fixed price. Before sunset, a payment of 600 gold dragons, along with an additional sum as a penalty for breach of contract, was delivered straight to the Night's Watch office and placed on Aegor's desk. The man who brought the gold also carried a message from his employer to Aegor and Tyrion. Next time you have inside information, we can work together. No need for tricks. As Aegor and Tyrion stared at the large sack of gold on the table, a heavy silence filled the room. Aegor was drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding. If not for Arya's first-hand information, wouldn't his entire venture in Westeros have collapsed before it even began? Meanwhile, Tyrion sat deep in thought, his brow furrowed. If even the Red Keep, a royal stronghold, was so riddled with leaks, then was the so-called peace and stability of the Seven Kingdoms nothing more than an illusion. Arya had no idea that she had inadvertently become the greatest benefactor of the Night's Watch enterprise. Thanks to the girl's timely revelation, worth its weight in gold, quite literally, Aegor had managed to survive the most significant financial crisis since arriving in the world of ice and fire. This entire operation had relied heavily on luck. There was no shame in admitting that, but as the saying goes, luck is a part of one's strength as well. Through the combined forces of fortune and strategy, the Night's Watch enterprise not only weathered the crisis but also saw a dramatic increase in available funds. In theory, all of the Night's Watch's financial resources, though now effectively managed by Tyrion, had not only covered their outstanding debts but also reached a level where they could withstand full withdrawals and redemptions without breaking the capital chain. On the very day the orders were finalized, more than half of the initial deposits miraculously returned to the Night's Watch office, now doubled. The remaining portion was reluctantly handed over after Igor personally led his men to press the merchants for payment backed by signed agreements. It was worth noting that Tyrion had advised Aegor to take careful note of the order in which these merchants paid their penalties. The faster they had access to inside information, the stronger their connections and backing. Creating a record of these dealings could prove invaluable in forming future alliances and navigating the city's power structures. Aegor readily accepted this wise counsel. What followed was the inevitable wave of bond redemptions. King Robert, the most powerful and hot-tempered man in Westeros, wasted no time negotiating with the so-called Alliance of the Righteous. Instead, he issued an ultimatum. When the rebels failed to respond within a few days, he promptly called for full mobilization, summoning the Lords of the Realm and preparing to assemble the entire royal army to crush the rebellion. Under these circumstances, it was only natural that bondholders would seek to reclaim their gold dragons in order to purchase supplies and equipment for themselves, their knights, and their retainers. This was not an act of financial sabotage but a practical necessity, and Aegor and Tyrion, recognizing this, chose to act accordingly. Rather than enforcing early withdrawal penalties, they graciously waived them. Any bondholder who presented their bonds at the office could redeem their full principal plus a minimum of 1 month's interest. The earliest investors, those who had held their bonds for more than a month, even received returns equivalent to 2 months' interest. This decision meant an additional expenditure of several dozen gold dragons, but it was far from an impulsive giveaway. The goal was to establish goodwill by ensuring a smooth and amicable settlement. They were betting on future opportunities. If these nobles and wealthy investors found themselves in need of profitable ventures after the war, they would remember the Night's Watch enterprise as a reliable place to reinvest their wealth. While the remaining net assets controlled solely by the Night's Watch enterprise were already substantial, further expansion and development would always require more capital. No one ever complained about having too much money. Under the bright summer sun, the royal host began to assemble more than 10 miles north of King's Landing. Similar gatherings were taking place across Westeros, in the Westerlands, the Reach, the Stormlands, the North, and even in Dorne. The Iron Throne was a monarchy in name, but in reality, the king's power was only as strong as the noble houses that supported him. His control over the Seven Kingdoms depended entirely on his ability to command and enforce loyalty. Fortunately for Robert, his military prowess and history of victories made him a formidable force. After more than a decade of careful governance by Jon Arryn, the old alliances that had carried Robert to the throne remained largely intact. Author's note: this chapter is where truth proves more dangerous than lies and foresight reveals its blind spots. Aegor learns that dismantling one web can set the whole realm trembling, dragging war, gold, and rumor into collision. In Westeros, even victory demands payment, and luck often decides who survives the bill.
Meanwhile, Littlefinger, who had originally sought to provoke discord between House Stark and House Lannister, had been removed from play. In this relatively stable political landscape, the so-called Alliance of the Righteous had emerged as an unwelcome disruption. For the four great houses tied by blood and marriage, Lannister, Stark, Baratheon, and Tully, there was no question of their support. They were determined to break the Vale's uprising and rescue the besieged Eyrie. Even the two houses that had once stood against Robert, House Tyrell of the Reach and House Martell of Dorne, both former Targaryen loyalists, dared not openly defy the king's summons. Tyrion was quick to predict that the Tyrells and Martells would each send important representatives, along with just enough troops to fulfill their obligations without fully committing to Robert's cause. Westeros now projected an image of unity, preparing for war. The last time such widespread cooperation had been seen was during the Greyjoy Rebellion. Even the Ironborn, notorious for their defiance, had answered the call, sending a fleet in token support. Though their ships were of little use in an inland campaign against the Vale, their gesture sent the right message. None of this had much to do with Aegor, or at least that was what he told himself. As an outsider with no real roots in this world, he had no intention of profiting from war. His focus remained on his business. His priority was to complete the first factory, fulfill orders from the church and smaller clients, and secure the final payments. Strengthening the financial foundation would allow him to reinvest in further expansion. One advantage of living in a pre-industrial society was that things were relatively straightforward. Just 2 weeks after narrowly surviving the initial financial hurdle, the first production line was already operational despite the factory itself not yet being fully built. Hundreds of kilograms of raw materials for papermaking were fed into a massive stone mortar. A wooden pestle, thicker than a man's arm, crushed the materials under the steady motion of a water wheel. The resulting pulp was treated with alkaline powder before being sent to the next stage of processing. The secret to a successful assembly line was simple. As long as raw materials were continuously fed into the system, production would never stop, regardless of how long individual processes took. The printing plates for the 7-pointed star Bible, calendars, and other texts were already prepared, awaiting the first sheets of paper from the production line. Meanwhile, hired bards and writers had begun transforming oral stories into written works. Since Aegor had promised them full authorship rights, they worked diligently. Among all these projects, one story held Aegor's particular interest, a novel based on his adventures. Titled The Fantastical Adventures of the Night Watchman, the tale followed the journey of a young traveler setting out into the world for the first time. It chronicled his adventures across distant lands, his struggles and triumphs, and ultimately his growing curiosity about the shape of the world itself. In the final volume, the protagonist, having explored every known land, made the fateful decision to set sail on a daring voyage to circumnavigate the world. But fate had other plans. Shipwrecked on a foreign shore, he found himself in Westeros, where circumstances forced him to join the Night's Watch. By sheer chance, he rose through the ranks, eventually arriving in King's Landing to secure provisions, supplies, and recruits for the Wall's defenders. There were no professional storytellers in this world, and the works penned by bards tended to be rough and disjointed. However, the story itself was fresh and engaging enough to capture interest. The name Aegor West never appeared in the novel, but anyone with a bit of insight would recognize that it was about the chief logistics officer of the Night's Watch office in King's Landing. This was a bold public relations experiment. The more copies sold, the more people would come to know of his experiences. When the day came for him to leave the Night's Watch, the backlash and opposition would be far less severe. Aegor glanced at drafts of several other novels. Compared to the one he had personally outlined and authorized, the nightly tales passed down by the bards felt stale and formulaic. He had a strong hunch, even from a purely financial perspective, his story would be the most profitable. Meanwhile, preparations were also underway for the material Tyrion had referred to as unsuitable for polite company. Since no experts in the field could be found, Tyrion took a more direct approach. He invited painters and bards to move into his favorite brothel, where they could collaborate in an atmosphere best suited for inspiration. Their goal was to create an illustrated book that combined vivid imagery with suggestive storytelling. The dwarf proudly presented the draft of this risque book to Aegor. To be honest, compared to the famous erotic works from Aegor's previous world, this was absolute garbage. In his opinion, it was barely better than crude street performances. Still, it was a novelty. How well it would perform in the market remained to be seen. True to his promise to his apprentice, Aegor handed the book to Arya, who had been waiting beside him with eager eyes. He expected her to take one look, turn red, and throw it back at him. Instead, she became utterly engrossed in reading, her face flushing as she muttered, "Master, you are awful." Tyrion barely managed to reclaim the manuscript from her. Everything was progressing smoothly. The experimental workshop's paper production was, for now, solely reserved for printing the 7-star Bible and calendars. Once the factory outside the city reached full production capacity, all the groundwork they had laid would finally come into play. Aegor looked forward to that day. Instead, he received an unexpected visitor. A royal servant from the Red Keep arrived at the Night's Watch office, announcing that King Robert required the presence of a true brother of the Night's Watch, someone who had sworn the oath, to accompany the royal army. Unfortunately, Aegor was the only one in King's Landing who met the requirement. "Why does the army need a Night's Watchman?" Aegor asked, eyes widening. He immediately reached for the most reliable and time-honored defense. "The Night's Watch swears to take no part in the conflicts of the 7 kingdoms. His Majesty has decreed that once the Bloody Gate is taken, the nobles responsible for the rebellion will be given the option to take the Black." The servant replied, nose held high. "A sworn brother is required to receive them and escort them to the wall." "But that falls under the jurisdiction of the Raven's Shadow. That's the chief steward's responsibility. I am the chief logistics officer." The servant gave him a blank stare, clearly incapable of distinguishing between the various Night's Watch titles. He frowned. "You can either come with me and explain that to the king yourself, or I'll return and inform His Majesty that you refused his request. Either way, it's your problem. Now come along." "Why are you worried? You won't be sent to the battlefield. Just think of it as a trip." Tyrion shrugged, trying to reassure him. "If you don't climb the mountain, the valley still offers a nice view." "Are you afraid Robert will lose? At worst, it'll be a stalemate." "I'm not worried about my safety, it's just our business is finally taking off. If one of the 2 key figures behind the Night's Watch suddenly disappears, it's bound to cause some disruption." "2 key figures, Tusk, I appreciate the flattery." Tyrion rolled his eyes. This man always had a way of delivering compliments in the most unexpected manner. He had to admit it was a skill he admired. "With me in King's Landing, nothing major will go wrong. As for you, just don't try to talk your way out of the king's orders. Go, do as you're told. When you return, the factory will be running at full capacity. I might even have an entire network of allies set up for you. At that point, all I'd have to do is introduce you to the right people, and in a matter of minutes you become someone with real status in King's Landing, someone with influence, someone people recognize, and to the Brothers of the Night's Watch, someone in charge." "Oh well, I'll have to trouble you with that then." "You're welcome. I can't let that big shot reputation you gave me go to waste. Now sign a statement authorizing me to handle all matters of the Night's Watch office while you're away. Leave one of your seals with me and I'll take care of the rest. Enjoy your trip to the Vale." Aegor decided to follow Tyrion's advice. He didn't have much of a choice. It wasn't that he thought the Night's Watch enterprise would collapse without him. His partner was an exceptional man, unparalleled in the Seven Kingdoms. Aside from knowledge, expertise, height, and physique, Tyrion outclassed him in almost every way: connections, strategy, and political maneuvering. With the worst of the financial crisis behind them, there was no reason to believe disaster would strike in his absence. And knowing Tyrion's character, he wasn't worried about being abandoned while he was away. Aegor wasn't afraid, he was frustrated. Tyrion had no idea that this war, in a sense, had started because of him. Months ago, when he watched Bran fall from the tower at Winterfell, he had assumed fate and the story's trajectory were unchangeable. But now he realized that not only could the plot be altered, but it could also be reshaped with astonishing ease. If he found the right pressure points, a single push could send events spiraling in unexpected directions. The dominoes had already fallen, and not only had he lost his advantage of knowing the future, but the consequences of his own actions were now coming back to haunt him. It was not a pleasant feeling. There was a word that described the situation perfectly. What was it again? Oh right, backlash. He was now suffering from the very rumors he had spread. The king had given his command. Aegor wasn't technically in charge of the decision, but it seemed that Eddard Stark was the only man in Westeros who could outright refuse Robert Baratheon without consequence. Besides, for business to continue functioning, it required the approval, and sometimes the direct involvement of the ruling class. No matter how he looked at it, his business dealings in the Vale would inevitably be affected. There were still a few days before the royal army set out. His best option was to use this time wisely, to ensure Tyrion was informed of his plans, issue whatever orders were necessary, and hope that his partners and subordinates could carry them out in his absence. The next scheduled shipment of supplies to the Night's Watch was still a month away. Aegor had originally planned to use this shipment as a stepping stone for his broader goals. In addition to the items listed by the Lord Commander, he intended to donate additional supplies voluntarily. The food at the Wall was barely passable. He had arranged to send several thousand pounds of meat and barrels of wine with each shipment, ensuring his brothers on the Wall could enjoy something better than their usual rations. Outside of officers, most of the Night's Watch only had a single set of winter clothing. If their clothes got wet or needed washing, they had to sit shivering by the fire, waiting for them to dry. He planned to gradually provide spare winter garments for the rank and file. If this practice continued, it wouldn't be long before a new pattern emerged. Every time the logistics department resupplied the Wall, the defenders would receive fresh food, warm clothing, and perhaps even better boots, gloves, and hats. With these tangible benefits, the new department would become an essential presence in the lives of the men at the Wall. And the best part, compared to weapons and large food shipments, these extra provisions were cheap. A small investment for immense goodwill, but it wasn't enough to simply provide these things. He would make sure every crate and every sack carried a clear label, property of the Night Watch Logistics Department, supplied by Aegor West. He would not let the men at the Wall enjoy his gifts without knowing exactly who had provided them. Tyrion highly approved of the plan, but when Aegor calculated the timing, he realized there was a high chance he wouldn't be in King's Landing when the next batch of supplies was delivered. There was no way around it. The meat and wine would be handled by merchants introduced by Tyrion, leaving it up to them to source the goods and ensure they reached the Wall. As long as the shipments arrived in good condition and didn't make anyone sick, that was all that mattered. As for the clothing, Aegor sought out Nina and tasked her with handling it. Not only would she need to prepare a batch of thick, warm black garments, but each item had to be embroidered or marked with Night's Watch Logistics Department and produced by Aegor West in a way that would be difficult to remove. Given that Nina's family was already involved in the textile and clothing trade, this was a relatively simple task for her. It would also serve as a test to see if she was not only intelligent but also capable of handling practical matters. He hoped the sharp-minded people around him wouldn't let him down. He had no way of competing with frontline commanders for glory or prestige while staying in the relative safety of the rear, but carving out a presence for himself and ensuring his brothers remembered his contributions should not be too difficult. The bond redemptions were nearly complete. Those who had not yet claimed their money had either forgot or had no urgent need for the 100 gold dragons. In the end, more than 1,200 of the 2,000 gold dragons had been withdrawn, falling squarely between the crucial thresholds of 50 and 70%. 3 days after receiving the king's orders to accompany the army, Aegor packed his belongings, took along the young attendant Casey, whom he had recruited in King's Landing, and set out for the army's assembly point. The horses galloped forward, the metal rings on the reins and bits jingling with each movement. Bathed in the morning sun, the chief logistics officer and his attendant rode out through the Gate of the Gods, leaving behind the stench and towering walls of King's Landing. The assembly point was still some distance away, but Aegor could already see smoke rising from the army's camp. As they rode through the farmland flanking the road, the distant murmur of thousands of voices drifted toward them like the rolling tide of an unseen sea. The closer they got, the louder the noise became. As they crested a small dirt hill, the sounds sharpened and the vast sprawl of the encampment came into view. Beneath the summer sun, a seemingly endless expanse of tents stretched across the landscape, their canvas tops scattered like mushrooms after a storm. Countless campfires sent pale wisps of smoke curling into the sky. Neatly arranged warhorses stood in lines stretching for miles. The surrounding forests had been stripped to provide wood for long poles to hoist the banners. Some of the siege engines, too large to be hauled into battle at a moment's notice, were already assembled along the King's Road, some towering higher than a man. Sunlight glinted off thousands of spearheads, casting fiery reflections. The grand pavilions of the lords and knights stood in stark contrast to the smaller, more modest tents of their men, dotting the fields in an uneven yet organized sprawl. Within the sea of canvas, soldiers moved like waves, some mounted on horseback, some marching with spears, swords, or bows in hand. Elsewhere, teamsters drove carts loaded with supplies, while servants tended to livestock near the edges of the camp. The air was thick with sound, the clatter of weapons, the whinnying of horses, the shouts of soldiers and merchants alike, blending into a chaotic, deafening symphony. Somewhere amidst the din, the high-pitched laughter of children could even be heard. The scent of food and sweat mixed with less pleasant odors, the unavoidable byproduct of thousands of men living together in close quarters. It was in a way fresher than the filth of King's Landing, yet it remained an unmistakable stench. Wherever large numbers of people gathered, they needed to eat, and inevitably they needed to relieve themselves. Robert's call to arms had created what now stood before Aegor and Casey, a sprawling war camp, teeming not only with soldiers and lords but also with servants, merchants, and the countless others who had followed in their wake. Not to mention Casey, a young man from King's Landing who had only just come of age. Even Aegor, who had served as a soldier before, found himself momentarily stunned by the sheer scale of the military camp before him. Compared to this gathering of forces, Castle Black was nothing more than a small outpost. Of course, in terms of purpose, the Night's Watch was indeed the sentinel of the Seven Kingdoms, so the contrast made sense. How many men were assembled here? 10,000, 20, 50. 100,000. As the saying goes, 1,000 men seem to stretch from earth to sky, and 10,000 are beyond counting. For anyone without professional scouting experience, estimating the size of an army beyond a certain point was impossible. 10,000, 50,000, or 100,000 once up close, it all blurred together. This was precisely why in the ancient world, rulers often exaggerated their troop numbers to intimidate their enemies. To be honest, Aegor had no idea how many soldiers stood before him. But after listening to Tyrion's breakdown of the Crownland's population and economy, he had a rough estimate. The so-called Crownlands functioned more like a direct royal domain. In essence, the duke of this land was none other than the king himself, Robert Baratheon. This region stretched south of the Vale, east of the Riverlands, and north of the Reach and the Stormlands. If not for its coastal access, it would have been a constant battleground. Historically, it had never been an independent kingdom, but instead a contested land fought over by the Riverlands, the Stormlands, and other powers. This cycle of chaos only ended when Aegon the Conqueror landed here with his dragons and used it as his base of operations, ultimately establishing his capital. Before the Targaryen conquest, this area had a total population of less than 100,000. But after 3 centuries of rule under the Dragon Lords, with a combination of immigration and natural growth, it had transformed into a prosperous land, home to King's Landing, the largest city in Westeros and boasting the highest population density and wealth per capita. Wealth aside, the sheer number of people here made it stand apart. The Crownlands were relatively small, and if one excluded the abnormal population of King's Landing itself, its total population was roughly on par with the sparsely populated north. Given the lack of precise population records in this era, estimates put the total number of inhabitants in the Crownlands at around 2 million. Robert's campaign against the Vale was a localized conflict, not a full-scale war. This wasn't a general mobilization, and under such circumstances, rulers typically sought to balance military needs with maintaining domestic stability. The goal was to ensure the war did not disrupt daily life, damage economic productivity, or weaken the realm's long-term sustainability. Given the technological and economic constraints of the time, an initial mobilization rate of 0.5% to 1% of the total population was a reasonable expectation. That translated to a standing army of 10 to 20,000 men, not counting the merchants, camp followers, and laborers accompanying them. The exact number depended entirely on the authority of the ruler and his ability to command the allegiance of the lords. Aegor couldn't say with certainty how many men stood before him, but it was definitely more than 10,000. And to put things in perspective, during the later siege of King's Landing, Cersei Lannister had struggled to muster even a few thousand men in desperation. This vast difference in response numbers was the most tangible proof of how much power truly lay in the hands of a king in this era of rule by strength. "There are so many people," Casey muttered, his eyes wide with amazement. Aegor had the same thought. But as the chief logistics officer of the Night's Watch, and in the young man's eyes a big shot, he had to at least appear composed. "It's quite a force," he said calmly. Let's see what accommodations the king has prepared for us and how we're expected to move with the army. Seeing his leader remain so unfazed, Casey suddenly felt that his own inexperience must be showing. Determined not to seem too awestruck, he nodded and quickly spurred his horse forward, following Aegor down the slope toward the camp. If an army of this size marched north to the wall, they could crush the wildlings by the hundreds of thousands, leaving them too battered to even remember their own names. But instead, this force was marching on the Vale to rescue a madwoman who had murdered her own husband, simply because she had once been a Tully and was now the mother and legal guardian of the young Lord of the Eyrie. Earlier on the road, Aegor had been grumbling to himself about how Robert was already planning for victory, thinking about sending Royce and other lords to the wall before a single battle had even been fought. The fact that he had specifically summoned a Night's Watchman for the task was frankly absurd. That fat pig is far too optimistic. But after seeing the sheer scale of this army, Aegor understood where Robert's unshakable confidence came from. Robert may have been extravagant and irresponsible when it came to governance, but in terms of sheer personal authority and leadership, he was leagues above most rulers. His reckless spending had undoubtedly left the Iron Throne buried in debt, yet it had also bought him immense loyalty from the middle nobility and the lesser knights, men who had received honors and rewards under his reign. This concept of borrowing from the future to maintain present stability through financial overreach, whether by accident or design, was a surprisingly advanced strategy. Granted, the kind of loyalty and control bought with coin was inherently fragile, but when wielded by a leader who won battles consistently, it became something else entirely. As long as Robert remained undefeated, and as long as he didn't suffer a catastrophic loss, his influence, however tenuous in peacetime, was as potent as any standing army under the most disciplined social system. And these were just the forces personally led by the king. Once the other 6 kingdoms joined the fray, if not for the natural fortifications of the Bloody Gate, the so-called alliance of the righteous in the Vale wouldn't have lasted beyond a single engagement. During his time working at the Night's Watch office in King's Landing, Aegor had familiarized himself with the sigils of Westerosi nobility. As he rode deeper into the army camp, clad in his black cloak, he recognized many of the banners fluttering around him. The golden-crowned stag of House Baratheon was the most common, which was no surprise given Robert's personal summons. But beyond that, he spotted a variety of other heraldry, emblems emblazoned on soldiers' surcoats, painted onto wooden shields sewn into tent flaps or decorating the lances of knights. There were the crossed warhammers of House Lake, the sheep holding a golden cup of House Stokeworth, the light green waves of House Hayford, and many more. Aegor didn't bother counting them all. It was easy to guess that every house in the Crownlands had sent men. When the king himself issued a mobilization order, even the smallest, most destitute noble families would find a way to answer. Even if all that remained of a house was a lone heir, he would still crawl to the battlefield with his banner, desperate to earn glory and rebuild his family's fortunes. With so many noblemen gathered in one place, this would have been a prime opportunity for a financial scheme, some way to manipulate or profit from their ambitions. But right now, Aegor had a more pressing concern. He needed to find the king, or at the very least someone who could tell him where he was supposed to be stationed. After asking several soldiers, he came up empty. None of them seemed to be aware that King Robert had summoned a Night's Watchman. This irritated Aegor. It was the sort of frustration that came with dealing with the vast gap in power and status. He had already suspected that the order had been nothing more than a passing thought Robert had while drinking. After all, the servant who had come to fetch him hadn't even carried an official letter or token of proof. But even if it was a drunken whim, he had still been compelled to obey. The reason was simple: if he showed up, Robert would likely forget about it. But if he hadn't shown up and the king did remember, he'd be in serious trouble. Either way, his valuable time that could have been spent building his business, was now being wasted on a pointless campaign. Aegor had cursed the fat stag countless times in his mind, but now that he was here, there was no turning back. Refusing to report wasn't an option. Beyond the broader consequences, there was also the matter of his own reputation. How would it look to his personal attendant if he wandered around aimlessly, unable to even confirm his orders? He couldn't keep running in circles and hitting dead ends. He needed to resolve this quickly before it became outright embarrassing. He urged his horse forward, pushing deeper into the encampment. To be honest, the discipline, organization, and overall quality of military forces in this era were terrible.
Author's note: this chapter pulls the lens wide, revealing how overwhelming unity can be just as dangerous as chaos. While kings gather armies and banners fill the horizon, Aegor is forced to confront the cost of influence without control. In a world of marching hosts, even a careful planner can be swept along by momentum.
He had simply followed the king's road and ridden straight into the heart of the army without anyone stopping him. There were no enemies for hundreds of miles, but what if he had been an assassin? Aegor had to wonder if he knew exactly where to go. Could he have ridden all the way to Robert's tent, only to be stopped at the last moment by the Kingsguard? He wasn't sure if Robert's personal guards were even present in the camp yet. Either way, if there were ever such things as explosive weapons in this world, assassinating a king would be almost too easy. Finally, he spotted someone familiar, one of the nobles from King's Landing who had purchased bonds from the Night's Watch enterprise. Even better, the man had redeemed them just 2 days ago, meaning they had met twice and exchanged at least a few words. Good, Aegor thought. At least I never gave him trouble over the early redemption penalty. Now I don't have to worry about him pretending not to know me. The knight did indeed remember Aegor, not just because his investment had earned him several gold dragons in interest upon redemption, but also due to Aegor's distinctive black attire and foreign features as a sworn brother of the Night's Watch. Recognizing him at a glance, the knight not only greeted him warmly but also introduced him to those around him. This is the Night's Watchman I mentioned before. You all thought it had to be a scam, but I withdrew my entire investment and actually received 3 gold dragons in monthly interest. As far as I know, nearly everyone who answered the king's call cashed out their bonds to buy equipment. That's just how things are. 3% interest? Another knight looked surprised. I don't get it, where is the Night's Watch getting this kind of money? As for our profits, Aegor interjected smoothly, if you have more than 500 gold dragons you can invest directly and earn even higher returns. For details, once we've dealt with this rebellion and returned to King's Landing, you can visit my office. It's directly across from the garrison's east camp. I'd be happy to give you a full introduction. And if you'd like to see the Night's Watch factory in operation, that can be arranged as well. He delivered his pitch in a matter of seconds before seamlessly shifting the conversation back to the matter at hand. Now then, which kind-hearted knight would be willing to deliver a message to King Robert for me? I know one of the Kingsguard on duty today. I'll speak with him on your behalf, the knight who had bought bonds offered, thumping his chest in assurance. After all, he had personally profited from the Night's Watch investment, and a favor was the least he could do. Wait here for my return, don't go wandering off. Much appreciated. Standing outside a tent marked with 3 red stripes, Aegor spent some time conversing with the knights. He spoke persuasively, pitching the Night's Watch enterprise with ease, and soon several of them showed interest in both the bonds and the industry he described. By the time their discussion ended, many had already expressed their intent to visit his office in King's Landing once the war was over. This unexpected gain significantly eased Aegor's frustration at what had felt like wasted time. In truth, first impressions mattered in any world. When he had first approached the knights for directions, both he and his attendant Casey had looked respectable enough. Then the knight who recognized him had personally vouched for him. And when they heard that this chief logistics officer of the Night's Watch was managing hundreds, if not thousands of gold dragons, their wariness vanished. It no longer mattered that he wore black or belonged to the Night's Watch. In their eyes, he was simply a man of means. Aegor had long understood this simple reality: wealth, or even the mere appearance of wealth, opened doors. It was little wonder that people instinctively flaunted their riches. After all, money was just another form of power, and those who controlled resources naturally commanded respect among their peers. It was a truth as old as time, applying to both men and beasts alike. About 20 minutes later, the knight who had gone to speak with the Kingsguard returned, accompanied by another man wearing a tunic embroidered with 2 stag antlers. Aegor recognized him immediately. Earl Buckwell. What were the odds? Aegor had a feeling this was too much of a coincidence, but he simply raised an eyebrow and held his tongue. The man before him was none other than the Lord of Staghorn Castle, a noble of the Crownlands who had once planned to invest in the Night's Watch enterprise. He had intended to put down 1,000 gold dragons for a stake in the paper mill, but the sudden civil unrest in the Vale had disrupted his plans before the funds ever arrived in King's Landing. Even though their deal had fallen through, the bond between them remained. The old earl might have been forced to halt his investment, but he was still the first nobleman to visit the Night's Watch office and personally inspect the papermaking workshop. Over 50 years of age and yet bold enough to take risks on new ventures, his decisiveness alone made him someone worth befriending. The gray-haired Earl Buckwell nodded to Aegor and the surrounding knights before speaking in a formal tone. His Majesty has ordered that the Night's Watchman be attached to the army of Staghorn Castle. I am responsible for your safety. With that, Aegor's position in the army was finally settled. The old earl bid farewell to the other knights, then led Aegor and their respective attendants toward the camp belonging to Staghorn Castle's forces. Truth be told, King Robert had completely forgotten about summoning you, Buckwell admitted once they were out of earshot of the others. It was only when your friend reminded him that he remembered. The earl shook his head with a small smile. This was hardly an honorable thing to reveal, but as a vassal he had no right to criticize his king, especially not one as powerful as Robert Baratheon. His Majesty was deliberating on where to place you when I happened to be present, so I volunteered to take you under my command. Oh well, I appreciate your kindness, my lord. Aegor had suspected this outcome all along. Still, hearing it confirmed made his heart sink. He had already resigned himself to this trip, but knowing for certain that he was only here because of a half-remembered whim made the entire ordeal feel even more absurd. Yet no matter how much he cursed Robert internally, he wouldn't be foolish enough to voice those thoughts before a high-ranking noble. At least not yet. You needn't thank me. Since you're here, it's best to make peace with it. King Robert's memory is unpredictable. He forgets new ideas quickly but often recalls old ones at inconvenient times. If this rebellion ends and he suddenly remembers wanting Royce and the others to take the Black, only to realize no one's there to handle it, well, you'd be in serious trouble. Buckwell had just given voice to the very concern Tyrion and Aegor had discussed earlier. If Aegor had been a typical sworn brother of the Night's Watch, an honorable man with no attachment to anything but his duty, he could have ignored the king's whims entirely. He could have disregarded Robert's foolishness and done nothing, since the oaths of the Night's Watch explicitly forbade interference in the politics of the Seven Kingdoms. Unfortunately, he was not that kind of man, and as long as the king issued an order, Aegor had no choice but to comply. Even if this entire campaign turned out to be nothing more than an empty trip to the Vale, it wasn't something he could afford to dismiss lightly. There was too much money on the line. "You're right," Aegor admitted. "I was already prepared to waste some time when I came here." "That's good. I understand that the Night's Watch is sworn not to involve itself in the internal struggles of the Seven Kingdoms, but this situation is different. This isn't the Six Kingdoms waging war on the Vale, this is the Seven Kingdoms united to quell a rebellion. The war isn't being fought against the Duke of the Vale himself. Strictly speaking, your presence here doesn't break any rules." Seeing the uncertainty on Aegor's face, Buckwell continued in a reassuring tone. "Besides, whether or not King Robert succeeds in breaching the Bloody Gate for the first time in history, no one will hold you accountable. There's no reason to worry." It was a reasonable point. The old Earl was a wise man. If Robert's forces broke through the Bloody Gate, the outcome was obvious. And if he failed, the most likely scenario would be a negotiated settlement, the king agreeing to withdraw his army in exchange for the Justice League guaranteeing Lysa Arryn's safety and delivering her for trial. As for the notion that a handful of Vale lords could somehow defeat an army led by Robert Baratheon himself, that was pure fantasy. Unless, of course, some other time traveler had appeared in the Vale and started manufacturing gunpowder. But barring that, there was no realistic scenario where the Righteous Alliance came out on top. I have already sent a letter to Castle Black requesting that an official be dispatched to the south. If the rebellion is quelled swiftly and without trouble, I will simply fulfill my duties as expected. But if things do not go smoothly, who will have the time to concern themselves with me? Once the crows arrive to take over my role, I can set down this burden and return to King's Landing without worry. The Earl of Staghorn and the chief logistics officer of the Night's Watch walked together toward the Buckwell camp, conversing along the way. Aegor quickly gathered more information. The forces from Staghorn Castle numbered 500, including 20 knights. The king planned to depart at dawn, heading for Salt Pens to rendezvous with the Riverlands army before moving to the mouth of the Vale, where they would wait for reinforcements from the other kingdoms. And then there was one last piece of news, one that made Aegor nearly burst into laughter. Robert had ordered Petyr Baelish to travel to Braavos and negotiate the next loan, ensuring that the realm did not plunge into financial ruin while waging war. Aegor couldn't hide his surprise. "How is that possible? I mean, isn't our Master of Coin still facing rather serious charges?" "Exactly, who knows?" Buckwell sighed. "That man has always been responsible for handling the Crown's loans with the Iron Bank. And now, with a war looming, there's no one else who can take his place in Braavos. Imagine it. We send the adulterer to borrow money and then we march off to rescue the adulterer. Only King Robert could come up with something so utterly ridiculous." The old Earl shook his head, swallowing whatever choice words he had nearly spoken. "Of course, this is only a rumor for now. We shouldn't assume it's fact without evidence, but if it is true, I doubt Littlefinger will ever return to Westeros." "Indeed," Aegor composed himself. It was absurd, yes, but then again, Robert had thought to summon a Night's Watchman for this campaign. Was there anything he wouldn't do? Unexpected as it was, this situation did not change the fact that Littlefinger had already been undone by his own schemes. Baelish was a noble in name only, stripped of power and influence. Even if he fled across the narrow sea, what could he possibly do? Would he dare to steal the Iron Bank's loan and start his own venture to challenge Westeros? That would be suicide. The Iron Bank would never support a rival to one of its most valuable clients. And as for the Faceless Men, well, they were not exactly known for leniency. With that conversation settled, they moved on to discussing Jarman Buckwell, who is currently stationed at Castle Black. Like most noble houses in the Crownlands, House Buckwell had originally been loyal to the Targaryens. During Robert's rebellion, Staghorn Castle had chosen the losing side. After Rhaegar fell at the Battle of the Trident, the heir of House Buckwell surrendered, was taken captive, and ultimately sent north to take the Black. Over the years, Jarman Buckwell had risen to the rank of Ranger Squad leader at Castle Black. Aegor himself had nearly been placed under his command. To some extent, it was this connection that had given Earl Buckwell a favorable first impression of the Night's Watch. The Night's Watch has rarely had much involvement with the Seven Kingdoms. Why then have they suddenly begun collecting provisions from the south and even starting industries? Now that they were away from Tyrion and the other Crownlands nobles, the old Earl finally voiced the question he had refrained from asking during his last visit to the office. For noble houses, sending a family heir to the wall was more than just an inconvenience, it was a catastrophe. With Jarman Buckwell serving as a sworn brother, the family had lost one of its most promising successors. Such a loss could easily lead to decline. It was only natural that the old Earl would be anxious. Aegor immediately understood the implication. The Earl saw hope in him. If Aegor West could leave the wall and operate freely in the south, then perhaps under the right circumstances Jarman Buckwell could do the same. Over 100,000 wildlings beyond the wall are desperate to cross before winter sets in. The Night's Watch is too weak to stop them. Change is inevitable, and change often means destruction. Aegor carefully avoided mentioning the White Walkers. Without solid proof, bringing up such things would only undermine his credibility. But the reason I was able to organize all of this, he continued, aside from the support of Lord Tyrion Lannister, is that I didn't offend anyone. It sounded like a clever turn of phrase, but in reality Tyrion had once summed it up in a much cruder yet entirely accurate way. The price wasn't too high. The real reason Tyrion had been able to pull Aegor from the wall aside from money and some strategic embellishments was that Aegor had been insignificant. He had no powerful allies, no sworn enemies. No one had been invested in his fate, and no one had cared enough to challenge the decision. When he left, there had been no outraged voices running to Lord Commander Mormont or King Robert to demand his return. But if a former heir of an earl, someone who had been sent to the Night's Watch as punishment for backing the wrong side in Robert's rebellion, wanted to leave, that was an entirely different matter. There was no exaggeration in saying that Robert's rule would not have lasted had he allowed such things. Even now, long after his rebellion, those who had fought against him had only two choices: switch allegiances or remove themselves from power entirely. That was the unspoken rule of Westeros. A king sat at the top of the feudal order, the greatest beneficiary of the noble system. Unless he was an utter fool, someone with a political mind as abysmal as Joffrey's, he would never be the one to break that system and weaken his own authority, not for something as trivial as a bribe. If anyone wanted to buy their way out of the Night's Watch, they would have to offer a price so high it would truly tempt the king. And even then they would have to ensure that no one in Westeros protested the decision. House Buckwell was wealthy enough that they could afford a sum in the thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands of gold dragons. But for Robert, a man who had been a king for years yet had no concept of how much daily necessities actually cost, that was nothing. It wasn't even a fraction of what he owed Tywin Lannister and the Iron Bank. Would a sum like that really interest him? Technically, the Night's Watch could ignore the king's opinions altogether. But in practice, in a land where all power ultimately answered to the throne, how many truly dared to disregard a king's will? People could talk about Frey's arrogance, Prince Oberyn's defiance, the Queen of Thorne's cunning, or the brutal audacity of the Boltons. But as long as Robert Baratheon still lived, and the alliances of House Baratheon, Stark and Arryn remained intact, even the boldest of schemers had to bide their time and keep their heads down. Even setting aside external politics, there was a more immediate problem. How much effort had Tyrion already put into persuading the Night's Watch leadership to release Aegor? It had taken extraordinary maneuvering just to get them to make an exception for someone as unimportant as him. Sir Jarman Buckwell, on the other hand, was a different matter entirely. He was not just a ranger, he was a political exile, a noble sent to the wall to ensure his house survived the rebellion. The real danger wasn't the lack of gold but the inequality of such an act. If the precedent were set that the right price could free a man from the wall, it would destroy the Night's Watch in an instant. Those with wealth or noble ties would scramble to find ways to buy their way out, while those without anything would be left seething with resentment, watching helplessly as others escaped. The leadership of the Night's Watch, as well as the rulers of the Seven Kingdoms, would never allow such a situation to unfold. If that ever happened, their response would be swift and brutal, a total crackdown to stop the problem before it spread. And if that day came, even Aegor, who had done everything by the book so far, might find himself dragged back to the wall. This was not something that could be handled easily. I see. Earl Buckwell nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken meaning in Aegor's words. He had been lucky to keep his head after choosing the losing side in Robert's rebellion. Trying to push further, seeking to undo his son's sentence, was an overreach. Still, he was not willing to give up entirely. But I have an idea, the old Earl said. Since you are the chief logistics officer, perhaps you could intervene in personnel assignments. Transfer Jarman to serve under your department as a logistics officer. Then order him to work in the Crownlands, officially tasked with procuring food and supplies at Staghorn Castle. That way everyone wins. The suggestion was completely viable in theory. But Aegor wasn't about to tell him the truth, that his position as chief logistics officer was little more than an illusion. Most people, upon hearing his title, assumed he was the fifth highest authority in the Night's Watch, ranking just below the Lord Commander, the Chief Ranger, the First Steward, and the Master of Arms. This misunderstanding, this illusion, was precisely what Aegor wanted them to believe, and so far it had been extremely beneficial. But the reality, he wasn't even close to having that kind of power. Even a random ranger captain carried more weight than he did. Right now, Aegor was lucky just to not be recalled to the wall. The idea of pulling strings to get someone else out, that was a battle he couldn't even start to fight. My lord, Aegor said carefully, I won't deceive you. He chose his words carefully, not outright lying but framing the truth in a way that would temper Buckwell's expectations. The logistics department was only recently established. It does not hold as much influence as the older divisions. I do have the authority to recruit new personnel as I see fit, but transferring someone from Castle Black, he shook his head. That is beyond my power, at least for now. After all, I have only been in office for 2 months. He paused for a moment before continuing. Once I expand the Night's Watch industry, build a network of allies at court, gain control over the bulk of the Watch's logistical supply, and eventually send my own trained men to the wall. Aegor painted a picture of what could be achieved if everything went according to plan. But in the end he concluded with a more serious tone. Influence and authority don't appear out of thin air. They must be earned. My lord, you have spent decades in power, you must understand this better than anyone. I do, Earl Buckwell nodded. The man in black before him had made his position clear. I will do everything I can to support your endeavors in King's Landing. As for investment, once this war is over, if Staghorn Castle's finances are still intact, we will continue as planned. Profit is secondary, I'm willing to take little or none at all. But please, Chief Logistics Officer, remember Jarman's situation. You have my gratitude, my lord. The Night's Watch will not forget your aid during this critical time for the defense of the wall. Dealing with intelligent men was always easier, with just a few words. Two individuals, or in this case, two small factions that had previously been strangers, had discovered common interests and even reached a preliminary agreement for cooperation. Aegor felt a twinge of guilt. The truth was he had no means of rescuing Jarman Buckwell, but in order to secure investment he had deliberately implied that it might be possible, just difficult. Perhaps this was just how things worked. The longer he played this financial game, the more he found himself changing. He was no longer simply an engineer. He had become a businessman, one who never missed an opportunity to promote his financial ventures, always steering conversations toward money and investment. Once upon a time he had been an honest man, the kind who never lied except to his parents or his girlfriend. But now, he could weave half-truths and grand promises without so much as blinking. It was not a pleasant realization, becoming someone he once disliked. But at least he had no intention of outright scamming his investors. This was a brutal world, and he, a man with no family name, no noble blood, and no real backing, couldn't afford to play the game any other way. Littlefinger, one of the most cunning figures in Westeros, had been easily toppled by a single rumor thanks to Aegor's interference. But that wasn't because Petter Baelish had been incompetent, it was because public perception was dangerous. Still, if there was one thing worth learning from Littlefinger, it was his ability to profit from chaos. Having just secured his first investment through a mix of diplomacy and deception, Aegor found himself wondering, what would Baelish have done in my situation? Dragged into a military campaign on a whim, forced to waste time at a crucial moment in his business's development, what would Littlefinger have done? The answer came to him quickly. Yes, this war was a show of strength for Robert. It was an opportunity for the king to relive the glory of battle, a way to remind the realm of his power. But for Aegor, a Night's Watchman, this was something else entirely. Most of the realm's nobles had answered the king's summons and gathered here. That meant that right now in one place was a collection of men who controlled wealth, land, and resources, and he had just been handed the opportunity to meet them, all without having to chase them down or beg for introductions. Tyrion had urged him to enjoy the trip, but Aegor had never been one to sit idly by while others worked themselves to the bone. While his partners in King's Landing toiled like dogs to keep their operations running, he would not simply wander the Vale admiring the scenery. He would seize this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. If this campaign was going to waste his time, then he would make it worthwhile. By the time he returned to King's Landing, he would have built the network he needed. Aegor and Lord Buckwell reached an understanding, and set aside the discussion of Jarman's potential release from the Night's Watch. Before long they arrived at the section of the camp occupied by the forces of Staghorn Castle, where dozens of tents bearing the sigil of House Buckwell, 2 stag antlers on a field of blue and white, stood in neat rows. The old earl assigned Aegor and his attendant a tent adjacent to his own, a generous arrangement given the circumstances. In times of war, securing private quarters, even a simple canvas shelter, was a privilege reserved for high-ranking officers and honored guests. At dawn the following day the army set out as scheduled. For all his flaws, Robert Baratheon was not a man who overslept when there was war to be fought. The sheer scale of the royal host, impressive when stationary, became even more striking once it stretched into a marching column. The line of soldiers and wagons extended beyond sight in both directions, disappearing into the morning haze. From where Aegor rode among the Staghorn men, he could neither see the head of the procession nor its rear. Clad in his black cloak amidst the gleaming armor of House Buckwell's soldiers, he stood out like a shadow among silver and steel. It wasn't long before word spread through the ranks there was a Night's Watchman marching with the army. Waiting to buy up captured prisoners at a discount, no doubt, one soldier joked. He'll haul them off to the wall soon as we're done here. None of them knew that Aegor had been forced into this campaign against his will. To them, the presence of a sworn brother of the Night's Watch was nothing more than an amusing oddity, a mascot of sorts. If even the crows are betting on our victory, the soldiers thought, then this rebellion must be as good as crushed. None of them spoke of the old superstitions of how black garb was said to bring ill fortune. If anything, Aegor's presence seemed to embolden them.
Author's note: this chapter turns a marching army into a marketplace where gold, favors, and reputation move faster than swords. Aegor learns that even in war camps, power belongs to those who network, persuade, and sell belief. Sometimes the most valuable battlefield is not the front line, but the crowd gathered behind it.
As they rode, Aegor remained by Buckwell's side, listening intently as the old knight recounted stories of Robert's rebellion. He committed each name to memory, every noble house whose members had been forced to take the black for backing the Targaryens. At first he entertained the thought, if I gave these families the impression that I had a way to smuggle their kin out of the Night's Watch, of course, it would only work if his business in King's Landing flourished. But if it did, could he use that leverage to attract more investors, more clients? Yet as quickly as the idea formed, he dismissed it. It had been over a decade since the rebellion ended. Most houses that had suffered for their loyalties had since recovered, their exiled sons forgotten or replaced by younger heirs. Only the Buckwells still clung to the hope of retrieving their kin, and that was because the family had failed to produce another male heir. This was an exception, not a trend. So much for running a rescue operation, he mused. Still, the war provided an opportunity. If nothing else, it was a chance to forge connections with Westerosi nobility. The royal army marched for 10 days, passing through several Crownlands villages and towns, including Sow's Horn, before finally reaching their first rendezvous point, the Riverland stronghold of Lord Harroway's town. Though the town bore the name of the once great House Harroway, that lineage had long since perished. In its prime, House Harroway had been powerful enough to be granted Harrenhal itself, but like every other house to claim the largest castle in Westeros, they had succumbed to its infamous curse, extinguished, their lands and titles scattered. Here 1,000 Riverland's troops guarded the ferry, ensuring that no rebels from the Vale could interfere with the King's crossing. Not that it was needed, Robert's army crossed the Trident without incident. With the river behind them, they set their sights on the Vale. One day later, they arrived at a place steeped in Westerosi history, the Crossroads Inn. Few places in the realm had seen as much misfortune as this humble 3-story inn. In the original timeline, it had been the site of many fateful encounters. It was here that Catelyn Stark and Sir Roderick had crossed paths with Tyrion Lannister, leading to his fateful capture. Here, Sandor Clegane had taken Arya Stark northward, cutting down Gregor's men along the way. Later still, Brienne of Tarth had passed through, setting yet another chain of events in motion. But now, thanks to Aegor's intervention, many of those stories would never come to pass. Still, the inn remained the crossroads of Westeros in more than just name. Its strategic location where the King's Road met the River Road made it a gathering point for travelers, merchants, and most importantly, armies. Anyone journeying between Winterfell and King's Landing passed through here. Any force marching from Riverrun to the Vale had to stop here. And so, it was here that the forces of the Crownlands and the Riverlands finally united. Nearly 20,000 Riverlords had joined the war effort, swelling Robert's host even further. Their banners bore the sigil of House Tully, led by Edmure Tully himself, son of Lord Hoster Tully, the man who had helped forge the Stag, Wolf, and Falcon alliance that had won Robert his throne. Lady Arryn, besieged in the Eyrie by the rebels of the so-called Righteous Alliance, was a Tully by birth. She was Edmure's sister, and blood was not so easily forgotten. The Riverlands and the Reach were unique among the 7 kingdoms. Despite being among the richest regions, neither had been ruled by native kings before Aegon's conquest. As a result, though their lords bore the title of Duke, their hold over their own lands was tenuous at best. They lacked the ironclad authority and deep-seated loyalty enjoyed by the Starks, Lannisters, or Baratheons. On the surface they were powerful, but in truth, they had little hope of ever seizing the Iron Throne or declaring independence. Their only path to maintaining power lay in strategic alliances and well-placed marriages. Fortunately for House Tully, Robert Baratheon was still king. His rule, however reckless at times, was stable enough that the Riverlords fell in line without resistance. With his authority behind them, the Tullys had no difficulty rallying a massive force. Aegor took note of the banners flying alongside the riverborne host. Even House Frey, infamous for its later betrayal at the Red Wedding, had joined the Riverlands coalition. That alone spoke volumes. Robert's grip on the 7 kingdoms was stronger than Aegor had anticipated. With the Crownlands and Riverlands now fully united, the royal host swelled to over 30,000 strong. That number counted only the fighting men, not the vast network of camp followers and supply trains that trailed behind them. For a feudal army, this was a staggering force, especially considering it came from just 2 of the 7 kingdoms, and they were not done yet. Without pause, the combined army pressed eastward. For Aegor, this second pass through the Crossroads Inn was just as brief as the first. There was no time to stop and enjoy its famed hospitality. 2 weeks after departing King's Landing, the army finally crossed into the Vale of Arryn. They marched until the narrow mountain pass leading into the heart of the Vale was visible in the distance. Then, at Robert's command, the host split in 2, forming a pincer-like formation on either side of the pass. The southern and northern flanks of the royal army dug in, completely cutting off the Vale from the outside world. With 30,000 men at his command and siege engines arriving soon, Robert had the strength to assault the Bloody Gate directly. But he did not. This was not just a campaign, it was a spectacle. Robert would not simply march in and crush the rebels. He would wait, he would let the full might of the 7 kingdoms assemble before striking. Aegor could see it clearly. The usurper's war was long past, and Balon Greyjoy's rebellion had been crushed a decade ago. The 7 kingdoms had begun to forget why they once feared Robert Baratheon. Now he intended to remind them. Aegor found it amusing. Eddard Stark had remained in King's Landing to govern in Robert's absence. The king had taken only 4 of his Kingsguard with him, the rest, including Jaime Lannister, had stayed behind to protect Queen Cersei and the royal family. That alone was telling. A civil war had erupted in the Vale, yet the greatest winners might very well be the Lannister twins, safe in the capital. Aegor could only shake his head. Here sat the king of the 7 kingdoms posturing before the bloody gate while his wife cuckolded him in King's Landing. And the best part, he was borrowing money just to afford the show. One thing was certain, displays of power were only effective when backed by true strength. Those who flaunted wealth they didn't have rarely met a good end. Aegor could only hope this rebellion didn't turn into an outright disaster, because if things went south he had no intention of being dragged down with it. Aegor knew full well that calling Robert's campaign a show of force was a subjective take, influenced by his own cynicism. After all, Robert Baratheon was no longer the warrior he had once been. He was a fattened king now, his prime long behind him. But more importantly, he had been raised as the heir to a great house, receiving an upbringing entirely different from that of Eddard Stark. If Eddard was the steady foundation, Robert was the commanding presence, and if both men had been alike in temperament, they likely would never have become such close friends. The king of the 7 kingdoms had not marched to the Vale solely for spectacle. Politically speaking, this was about more than reclaiming order. Robert intended to make his vassals remember their obligations, reminding them that feudal loyalty was not merely ceremonial. He had let them grow comfortable for too long. Now it was time to remind them what was owed. The feudal order was built upon a simple contract between lords and vassals, a system of mutual obligation. A ruler was expected to protect and maintain his vassals. Protection was straightforward. Robert's campaign to subdue the Vale's rebellion was a fulfillment of this duty. He would not only lift the siege on Lysa Arryn, but also ensure justice was served, whatever that might entail. To maintain his vassals meant granting them lands, titles, and people to rule over, ensuring they could sustain themselves through taxes and harvests. In return, the vassals had 2 fundamental duties. One, they could not act against their liege's interests, whether in life, honor, or wealth. Even speaking against the king in private was considered treasonous unless it was done as counsel to his face. 2, when their liege issued a summons, whether for war or governance, they were bound to answer. Eddard Stark had honored this by traveling to King's Landing to serve as Hand of the King. The lords of Westeros had answered by gathering their banners and marching to the Vale. It was a simple agreement in principle, but in practice, feudal obligations were rarely so clear-cut. One rule, however, was of paramount importance. It was also the reason Robert dared to wage war despite an empty treasury. When a lord summoned his banners, his vassals were responsible for supplying their own men. That meant Robert only needed to fund his personal retinue from King's Landing. The other 30,000 men and any additional forces yet to arrive would be financed by their own lords. The king did not need gold so long as his vassals could pay their own way. This was not trickery. It was the foundation of feudal society. Robert had been raised to understand this from birth. He knew his rights as a liege lord and exercised them without hesitation. Even if there had been another way to resolve the conflict, he had chosen war. And once war was chosen, his vassals had no say in the matter. Any who refused to answer his call would be guilty of treason. Once the rebels in the Vale were dealt with, Robert would turn his attention to those who had hesitated. The irony was that the Alliance of the Righteous, as the rebels called themselves, had also justified their actions under the banner of feudal duty. They claimed to serve House Arryn's rightful heir, young Robert Arryn, who was being held captive by his mother, the very woman suspected of murdering his father. The mutiny, they argued, was not rebellion but rescue. In their view, Lysa Tully was not a true feudal lord but an unworthy regent, a vassal who had seized power unlawfully. Robert Baratheon, however, saw things differently. As far as he was concerned, Lysa was the acting lady of the Vale, guardian of her son's birthright. That made her his vassal and therefore under his protection. At the heart of it, the conflict boiled down to a question of legitimacy. And in Westeros, legitimacy was determined by steel. Whoever won this war would be right. The royal army made camp at the mouth of the valley, establishing defensive lines just beyond the rebels' reach. Both sides cleared forests to prevent ambushes and spread their forces wide enough to avoid accidental fires or congestion. If the rebels attempted a raid, they would find both wings of Robert's forces prepared to respond. Robert also took steps to secure his supply lines. A secondary force was stationed at a crossroads miles behind the main camp, tasked with guarding provisions. Should the battle turn, these reserves could be deployed as reinforcements. For all of Robert's personal failings, his grasp of strategy was sound. He was no tactician like Stannis, nor a battlefield genius like Tywin Lannister, but he was no fool. His instincts as a warrior and war leader had not dulled completely. Aegor had to admit he could find little fault in the way the campaign was being conducted. Of course, he had never been a military man before his arrival in this world. Once the army had established its foothold, scouts were sent into the valley to assess the terrain and deliver Robert's demand for surrender. Messengers were also dispatched to the noble houses of the Vale who had not joined the rebellion, calling upon them to honor their feudal oaths. Many houses answered, but Robert, in another calculated move, did not integrate them into his main army. Instead, he ordered them to march against the holdings of the rebel lords, laying siege to their castles and strongholds. It was a shrewd maneuver. The politics of the Vale were murky at best. Who could say how many among these latecomers harbored sympathies for the League of Justice? By sending them elsewhere, Robert minimized the risk of betrayal within his ranks. It was, Aegor had to admit, an intelligent decision. A shame, then, that such a capable general made for such a terrible king. While only 2 of the 6 kingdoms had arrived thus far, Aegor wasted no time in his personal endeavors. He had resolved to meet as many nobles as possible, introducing himself, speaking of his work in King's Landing, and subtly promoting the Night's Watch industry. Most of the lords he approached regarded him with indifference. They granted him an audience out of politeness, given Robert's presence, but their patience was thin. After a few pleasantries, they would make it clear they had no further interest in entertaining him. In a matter of days, he had been dismissed more times than he could count, yet he was not discouraged. A first meeting rarely led to immediate trust, but if a man remembered his face, if he recalled their conversation upon a second encounter, then the foundation of a connection was already laid. In that regard, Aegor had advantages. For one, he was likely the first Night's Watchman most of these lords had ever met. And lastly, he carried something few had ever seen: books made of fine plant fiber paper printed with ink, in a land still bound to parchment and scribes. That alone was enough to intrigue the curious. The next army to arrive came from the north, nearly 10,000 strong, led by Robb Stark. It was an impressive force, considering the North's vast and sparsely populated lands. To summon so many men so quickly for a mere rebellion spoke to the loyalty House Stark commanded. Robert, in high spirits, rode out several miles to personally greet his friend's son. Next came the host from the Westerlands, 10,000 men led by Sir Kevan Lannister, Tywin's trusted second. They were fewer in number than the River Lords or the Northerners, but their presence overshadowed the rest. Their ranks gleamed with polished steel, their banners crisp and unweathered. Unlike the other assembled forces made up of hastily levied soldiers, over a third of these men were standing troops, regularly trained in Lannisport. Their discipline was obvious at a glance. Next came the 10,000 troops of the king's own family, House Baratheon of the Stormlands. In theory, their commander was Renly Baratheon, but as the king's younger brother and one of his counselors, he remained by Robert's side at all times. The task of mobilizing the army fell to his vassals, who handled it voluntarily, so there was no need to elaborate on the details. 5,000 men arrived from the Riverlands. As the only region in the 7 kingdoms with a population exceeding 10 million, sending such a small number was clearly a slight. However, these 5,000 were all true cavalry. Randall Tarley, who led them, explained that the long journey prevented him from sending more, but he personally pledged to supply provisions and fodder for the coalition forces. In the end, Robert accepted his reasoning. As for Dorne, that ever-defiant land, they were surprisingly cooperative, sending Prince Oberyn Martell with several thousand spearmen. After all, even Aegon the Conqueror had failed to subdue them, despite riding a dragon. The Iron Islands contributed over 100 ships of varying sizes, carrying more than 1,000 sailors in total. Aegor had only vaguely heard that their leader was a woman. After some thought, he deduced it could only be Balon Greyjoy's chosen heir, his daughter, Ashag Greyjoy. Soldiers who had seen her claimed she was a striking woman, but for Aegor such things were irrelevant. What was interesting, however, was that the Ironborn ships had picked up the Dornish spearmen on their way, allowing the Dornish contingent to arrive before the Riverlands cavalry, despite not being fully equipped with horses. Meanwhile, the fleet from Dragonstone and the forces of the Narrow Sea Lords, led by Stannis Baratheon, had already reached Crab Bay, seized Gulltown, and surrounded Runestone. A month after Aegor parted from the king, the armies and nobles of the 7 kingdoms had finally gathered. Now the entire Vale was encircled by Robert's loyal navy and army. At the Bloody Gate, the entrance to the Vale of Arryn, soldiers were packed shoulder to shoulder. More than 80,000 lords and troops were camped outside, their banners forming a vast, colorful forest. This show of the king's dominance and the first direct assault on the legendary stronghold that had never fallen was finally about to begin. The Bloody Gate stood between 2 perilous cliffs, the only passage from the Mountains of the Moon into the Vale of Arryn. It consisted of 2 watchtowers clinging to the rock face, a sealed gray stone arch bridge connecting them, and a series of battlements reinforcing the structure. From a distance, it looked like a massive rock had fallen from the sky, completely blocking the sole entrance to the valley. The terrain leading up to and beyond it was relatively flat, without significant elevation changes. Instead, the gatehouse itself completely sealed the pass, leaving not even a gap for a cat or dog to slip through unless the defenders chose to open it. Regardless, the Bloody Gate certainly deserved its reputation as the most dangerous pass in Westeros. With such a natural barrier, how could anyone hope to break through if the defenders were well prepared? Doubt not at Aegor, but he wasn't about to make rash assumptions about something outside his expertise. He decided to wait and see. That was all he could do, in fact. As a sworn brother of the Night's Watch, he was merely an observer. Even if every soldier nominally responsible for his safety charged into battle and perished, no one would expect or allow him to join the fight. One of the few benefits of being a man of the Night's Watch. The sun crested the peaks of the Mountains of the Moon. The army had already finished breakfast, and the morning's cooking smoke dissipated into the clear sky. Finally, the assault on the bloody gate began. The first weapons to be deployed were the crossbows and catapults. The soldiers hadn't been idle during their time camped outside the valley. In a matter of days, they had hastily constructed a large number of siege engines, with catapults being the most numerous. Now these primitive but powerful machines were rolled into position. They lined up in rows, though the narrow entrance of the valley limited their deployment. Had the space allowed, with the combined manpower and resources of the 6 assembled kingdoms, they could have built thousands of siege engines to batter the bloody gate into rubble. At the officers' shouted commands, bolts the size of spears were loosed from the crossbows, and the arms of the catapults swung forward. Stones far deadlier than any spear soared through the sky. The largest were so heavy that grown men struggled to move them, while even the smallest were the size of a man's head. The crossbow bolts proved ineffective, but the stones arced high, crashing down hundreds of meters away. Some smaller ones sailed over the bloody gate and landed inside the pass, while others struck the gatehouse or the walls. Those that hit men crushed them before they could even scream, reducing them to shattered bones and torn flesh. The stones that struck the walls sent splinters of rock flying in all directions, and the repeated impacts created the illusion that the entire bloody gate was shaking. The defenders fought back, but their counterattack was far weaker in comparison. Even with the advantage of high ground, their projectiles couldn't reach the enemy siege lines with enough force. The narrowness of the bloody gate made it easy to defend, but also restricted the defenders' ability to deploy large siege weapons of their own. In terms of firepower, the rebels had already gained the upper hand, and the projectiles being launched weren't just stones. Aegor saw thick smoke beginning to rise behind the bloody gate's walls. After several more rounds of bombardment, the defenders retreated into their fortifications, and their counterattacks grew sparse. "It's impressive," Aegor admitted to himself. But then what? The reason the bloody gate had remained unconquered for centuries wasn't just the massive wall blocking the valley entrance, it was the entire defensive complex behind it. The builders and their successors had reinforced the position with numerous battlements and towers, creating a layered defense system as formidable as a mountain. Even if the gate was breached, the fallen structure itself would still be an impassable obstacle. If the gateway collapsed entirely, forcing an army through would become even more difficult. Before Aegor could dwell on his doubts, he got his answer. Once the catapults had destroyed enough of the defenders' equipment and forced them to take cover, the next phase of the assault began. The first wave of archers and crossbowmen stepped forward, moving into position even as the siege weapons continued their bombardment. Advancing in disciplined ranks, they closed the distance by more than 100 meters before stopping within range. Then they raised their bows and loosed a volley of arrows. Something about the scene struck Aegor as eerily familiar: fire support. He stood there momentarily stunned. In his mind, warfare in this world was crude, primitive. He had assumed Robert's strategy would be a simple brute force assault, waves of soldiers carrying ladders charging the bloody gate like a relentless tide, clambering up the gray stone walls while the defenders did their best to hurl them down. But this was something else. He had guessed wrong. Damn television shows were messing with his expectations. As he stood there, still processing what he was seeing, the war drums began to thunder, and the battle cries rang out. The bloody gate was positioned at the narrowest section of the pass leading from the Mountains of the Moon into the Vale of Arryn. The space available for an attacking force to maneuver was extremely limited. Though 80,000 troops and over 100,000 logistical laborers were stationed here, no more than 1,000 men could charge the canyon entrance at any given time, meaning that most of the gathered army could do nothing but watch, much like Aegor, their only contribution being their shouts of encouragement. Mid the deafening cheers, a group of several hundred soldiers bellowed in unison as they surged forward, surrounding a massive siege engine, a chariot-like contraption 20 to 30 meters long equipped with a gilded battering ram. As the ram emerged from the crowd, a portion of the soldiers pushed the great machine forward, while the others clustered around it, likely to take turns operating the ram or replacing the fallen once the assault began. The siege vehicle was reinforced with fixed shields to protect both the structure and the soldiers escorting it. It sped past the trebuchets, pushing through a gap left by the crossbowmen who had been providing covering fire, and advanced toward the bloody gate. Aegor could hear the defenders shouting commands. The valley's garrison, which had been suppressed by the relentless barrage of stones and arrows from the besieging army, now re-emerged atop the battlements to retaliate. Rocks rained down from above, while countless arrows formed a misty curtain over the battlefield. The attacking archers did their utmost to pin down the defenders atop the walls, their arrows striking true and eliciting screams of agony. Meanwhile, the defenders focused their fire on the advancing siege engine, their arrows embedding themselves in the vehicle's frame and protective barriers, soon making it resemble a massive, bristling hedgehog. The narrow terrain of the bloody gate was both a blessing and a curse for both sides. At this moment, its greatest disadvantage was that the passage before the gate was too confined to allow more than one siege engine to approach at a time, making progress slow and arduous. Yet the overwhelming firepower of the besiegers was sufficient to cover the narrow battlements barely a few dozen meters wide, ensuring a steady toll on the defenders. A commanding voice rang out, and the catapults ceased fire. With the siege vehicle so close to the bloody gate, further bombardment risked hitting their own troops. Under the watchful eyes of tens of thousands, the siege engine pushed past obstacles, rolled over a shallow trench, and finally slammed into the gate itself. The defenders retaliated fiercely, hurling burning barrels of oil and heavy stones down upon the attackers, but despite the flames and falling debris, the battering ram swung into motion. Boom, boom. The dull, reverberating crashes sent a shudder through the battlefield. The cheers of the rebel army's spectators faded. Even Aegor found himself holding his breath. At that moment, it seemed as if the only sound in the world was the rhythmic pounding of the ram's iron head against the gate.
Author's note: this chapter peels back the myth of medieval war, revealing discipline, coordination, and calculated violence beneath the banners. Aegor watches history unfold and realizes that brute force alone never breaks legends, planning does. At the bloody gate, steel answers steel, and reputation is tested against reality. This chapter ends here, but the nation lives on. More worlds, more legends await on Fanfic Nation, where imagination reigns and every story begins with a choice. Subscribe and return for the next legend.